Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, let me say this clearly. What you are about to hear is not a fixed prophecy. It is a speculative warning story, a dark narrative built from fear, history, human arrogance, and the dangerous direction of modern life. But sometimes stories become powerful precisely because they feel uncomfortably close to the truth. Have you ever wondered whether the most terrifying war in human history might begin without the sound of a single bomb? Not with skies torn open by fire, not with cities erased in one violent flash, but with silence. A silence so complete, so unnatural, that people would not even understand they had already lost until it was far too late. More than a century ago, in a remote mountain village hidden beneath cold mist and stone, an illiterate shepherd was said to have seen impossible things. He did not know electricity. He did not know radio. He did not know screens, satellites, or digital networks. Yet in this reimagined tale, he spoke of glowing boxes that would rule human attention, of small devices people would hold in their hands like sacred objects, and of a future in which technology would not bring people closer, but quietly separate them from one another. That alone would be disturbing enough. But his darkest vision was not about convenience. It was about war. Not a war defined by visible destruction alone, but by the theft of human will. He spoke of a time when the great powers of the world would manipulate weaker nations, ignite conflicts far from their own homes, and prepare a weapon so unnatural that it would not tear flesh apart, but would instead strike directly at the mind, leaving cities standing while entire populations collapsed into helpless stillness. At first, that sounds impossible, almost theatrical. Yet the deeper you look into the fears of our own century, the less impossible it feels. We already live inside invisible systems, invisible signals, invisible influence, invisible dependency. We already trust tools we barely understand and leaders we barely know. So tonight, the question is not whether this story is literally true. The question is far more uncomfortable. What happens when a civilization becomes so dependent, so distracted, and so spiritually exhausted that it can no longer tell the difference between safety and illusion? The man at the center of this story is named Stefan Draven. In this fictionalized retelling, he was born in the late 19th century in a poor mountain settlement somewhere in Eastern Europe, the sort of place where winters lasted too long, roads turned to mud, and survival was more familiar than comfort. He owned no books. He had no formal education. His hands were cracked by cold weather, hard labor, and years of tending sheep across the same rocky slopes. By every modern standard, Stefan was nobody. He had never seen a train station packed with electric light. He had never stood before a television. He had never heard a radio broadcast. Even the idea of instant communication across continents would have sounded absurd to the people around him. And yet, in the story that survives around his name, he began falling into violent trance-like states in which he described objects, cities, and events from a future he could not possibly have understood. During those episodes, his body would go rigid. His breathing changed. Sweat soaked his clothes even in winter. Witnesses said his eyes would fix on some distant, invisible point, as if he were watching another century unfold in front of him. Unable to write, and barely able to explain what he saw, he turned to the only man in the village who could record his words with care. Father Elias, an aging priest who listened by candlelight and wrote down Stefan's broken descriptions in long, trembling lines. At first, the vision sounded absurd. Strange, glowing frames, moving images trapped inside flat surfaces, human voices traveling through empty air, a web connecting people without roads or letters. Stefan had no vocabulary for modern machines, so he described everything through metaphor. Windows of cold light, boxes that held false life, tiny handheld objects that whispered across great distances. The priest did not fully understand what he was hearing, but he recognized fear when he saw it. What unsettled Father Elias most was not Stefan's confusion. It was Stefan's sorrow. He did not speak like a man fascinated by wonders. He spoke like a man witnessing a slow catastrophe. as if the future was not arriving as a miracle, but as a bargain, a trade humanity would make without understanding the price. And according to Stefan, the first price people would pay was each other. Stefan did not say technology would destroy the world in one dramatic instant. His warning was quieter than that. He believed the first wound would be emotional, human, intimate. And in one of his most haunting visions, he described families living under the same roof while becoming strangers to one another. He saw parents, children, and grandparents sitting in the same room, but no one truly present. Their bodies remained together, but their attention had been captured by glowing devices that offered constant stimulation and endless illusion. He did not see connection. He saw captivity. He told Father Elias that future generations would hold small, shining objects in the palm of their hands and trust those objects more than they trusted the people beside them. They would sleep beside them, eat beside them, wake to them, reach for them in moments of fear, boredom, loneliness, and grief. These devices would promise closeness while quietly deepening isolation. They would create the appearance of endless communication while draining warmth from real human contact. That vision hits differently now, because it no longer sounds fantastical. It sounds familiar. Picture a family dinner in an ordinary modern home. Food on the table, plates full, everyone physically present, and yet the room feels hollow. A grandson laughs at something on his phone while ignoring the tired woman who cooked the meal. A daughter answers messages while her father speaks. A husband and wife sit together in silence, each lit by separate screens. The room is full of people, yet emotionally vacant. What Stefan saw was not just distraction. It was the collapse of shared attention, the slow erosion of family as a living force. He believed this emotional fragmentation mattered because societies do not collapse only from war and disaster. They collapse when the habits of loyalty, empathy, patience, and listening begin to die at home. Once that happens, people become easier to manipulate, easier to polarize, easier to isolate. A population disconnected from real human bonds can be controlled by spectacle, by fear, and by whatever signal dominates their senses. And that is what makes Stefan's warning more disturbing than a simple anti-technology sermon. He was not saying screens are evil on their own. He was saying that when tools become emotional masters, civilization becomes vulnerable at its roots. By the time the war arrives in his vision, humanity has already been weakened from within. Once Stefan moved beyond the collapse of family, his visions widened. The room, the village, the household table, all of it fell away. He began describing a world stage shaped by conflict, ambition, and manipulated hatred. He spoke of a sacred region drenched in old memory and endless grievance, a land revered by millions yet repeatedly torn apart by cycles of violence. In this rewritten narrative, he saw desert cities under smoke, ruined neighborhoods, and grieving families trapped inside a conflict that never truly ended. He told Father Elias that the people there would grow exhausted by war, sign agreements in front of cameras, smile in public, and speak the language of peace while privately nursing old rage. That detail mattered to him, not because he believed peace was impossible, but because he saw how often power wears the costume of peace while preparing the next betrayal. According to Stefan's warning, the world would be repeatedly deceived by staged pauses in violence. Treaties would be signed, handshakes would be shown, international leaders would pose for cameras. Yet beneath every polished ceremony, resentment would remain alive, waiting for its next excuse. This is where the story becomes broader than one region. Stefan was not only describing a particular conflict, he was describing a system, a world in which local wars become profitable theater for stronger nations, a world where ordinary people bury their dead while distant powers calculate leverage, influence, and advantage. In his visions, weaker states became battlefields not only for their own survival, but for the ambitions of outsiders. He described influential leaders in distant capitals, safe behind walls and guards, treating whole populations like expendable pieces on a board. They did not bleed, they did not starve, they did not send their own children first. Instead, they armed one side, provoked another, and turned suffering into strategy. Nations too proud to fight directly would wage indirect war through smaller countries, using weapons, media narratives, financial pressure, and ideological manipulation. For Stefan, this was the true obscenity. Not merely war itself, but the layered machinery behind it. The smiling officials, the televised sympathy, the secret deals, the speeches about stability made by people who thrive on instability. And somewhere inside that machinery, he said, another figure would rise. Not from the desert, not from the sacred land, but from the cold north. In Stefan's vision, the next turning point came from a frozen empire of distance, discipline, and fear. He described a vast northern nation wrapped in snow, ice, and silence, a place so large it seemed to stretch beyond reason. From there, he saw the rise of a leader whose physical appearance made him easy to underestimate. A smaller man, controlled, calm, not monstrous in outward form. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. At the beginning, Stefan did not see him as a villain. He saw a man who genuinely wanted to rescue his country from humiliation, weakness, and decay. A leader driven by memory, pride, and the promise of restoration. Someone who believed history had cheated his people, and who intended to reverse the decline. In the early years, he appeared disciplined rather than mad, strategic rather than theatrical, and many would admire him for that. But power, in Stefan's warning, never leaves the human soul unchanged. He said the northern leader would enter politics carrying the language of duty and national revival, then slowly be surrounded by flatterers, opportunists, loyalists, and men who confused fear with strength. Over time, suspicion would replace empathy. Isolation would replace reflection. Every threat would feel personal. Every concession would feel humiliating. Every compromise would look like weakness. The higher he rose, the less human he became. Stefan believed the tragedy of such a man is not that he begins as a demon, but that he drifts into becoming one. The original impulse to protect hardens into obsession. Love of country mutates into entitlement. Pride becomes grievance. Grievance becomes paranoia. And paranoia eventually demands force. By the time the world understands what has happened, the inner transformation is complete. This northern ruler would not necessarily launch the final catastrophe with his own hands. Stefan's vision was subtler. The man's greatest danger lay in what his presence would unlock: his rigidity, his fear of losing control, his willingness to escalate beyond reason, his refusal to back down once trapped inside the logic of power. Those traits, Stefan said, would mesh perfectly with the darker machinery already moving behind the scenes. He would become the hinge, not the whole door, the human symbol around which larger forces would align. And once those forces aligned, the nature of war would change completely. Most people imagine the Third World War in images inherited from the last century, under missiles crossing the sky, nuclear clouds, cities erased in flame, steel and fire, noise and shock. Stefan saw something colder. He said humanity's greatest horror would not arrive first as physical annihilation. It would arrive as paralysis. A weapon designed not to demolish buildings, but to strip living beings of will. Not an explosion that leaves a crater, but a silent strike that turns a city into a sleeping graveyard. In this fictionalized version of his warning, Stefan described underground facilities where brilliant scientists were forced or pressured into designing a new category of weapon. These were not battlefield engineers thinking only about range and impact. They were researchers of signals, frequencies, neurology, and the hidden interface between technology and the human nervous system. Their task, he believed, was not to wound flesh directly, but to overwhelm perception itself. The terrifying detail in his description was that the weapon looked almost merciful from a distance. No burning streets, no collapsed towers, no rivers of blood. Instead, an invisible field passing through the air, a silent wave, a strange pulse. People in homes, hospitals, schools, and military compounds would simply fall. Soldiers would drop their weapons without understanding why. Mothers would collapse beside their children. Drivers would go limp behind the wheel. Entire neighborhoods would sink into a state of forced unconsciousness. At first, that sounds like science fiction, but the logic behind the fear is what gives it power. A civilization already dependent on signals, screens, and integrated systems could become extremely vulnerable to weaponized forms of influence that bypass traditional defenses. The body need not be destroyed if the mind can be interrupted. The city need not be bombed if its people can be reduced to helpless stillness, and the aftermath, in Stefan's vision, was even worse than the attack. Those who woke would not wake whole. They would emerge disoriented, psychologically damaged, memory fractured, spirit broken. They would wander through intact streets that no longer belonged to living communities. The world would look recognizable, but function like a ruin. That is why Stefan feared silence more than fire. Fire at least announces itself. Silence allows evil to operate while still pretending order remains. And according to his vision, humanity built the weapon itself. Stefan's anger was not directed only at rulers and generals. It was directed at a civilization that had confused scientific ability with moral progress. He believed the world would one day reach extraordinary technical power while remaining spiritually childish, and that this imbalance would become fatal. To explain that imbalance, this rewritten story introduces a second figure from a later age, Adrian Voss, a brilliant engineer whose life echoes the tragedy of so many visionaries crushed by systems they might have healed. Adrian believed the planet was immersed in vast natural fields of energy that could be accessed cleanly, widely, and without endless destruction. His work was not about domination. It was about liberation. He imagined a world freed from dependence on extractive fuel, monopolized energy, and the political blackmail that always follows scarcity. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. In laboratories and workshop spaces, he built resonant devices that hinted at abundant, decentralized power. Rural communities could have been transformed. Cities could have reduced dependence on destructive industries. Nations might have had fewer reasons to fight over pipelines, shipping routes, and fuel reserves. Clean energy would not have solved every human problem, but it would have removed one of the darkest incentives for permanent conflict. And that, in Stefan's moral universe, is exactly why Adrian's work could not be allowed to thrive. The people who benefited from extraction, scarcity, and controlled dependence saw in his breakthrough not hope, but danger. If energy became abundant and difficult to monopolize, our empires would weaken, fortunes would shrink, entire systems of leverage would collapse. So Adrian's work was ridiculed, then obstructed, then quietly erased. Funding disappeared, facilities burned, patents stalled, public narratives turned him into a fool or fanatic. By the end, he had become a warning to others. Stefan saw this not as an isolated injustice, but as a pattern. Humanity repeatedly suppresses what could heal it and accelerates what could destroy it. It starves the compassionate inventor while rewarding the obedient weapons researcher. It calls exploitation practical and idealism naive. Then it acts shocked when the future turns cruel. The silent weapon, in that sense, is not just a machine. It is the final expression of a worldview that valued control above wisdom. Still, Stefan insisted that even at the edge of catastrophe, one path of survival remained. But it was hidden in symbols. After all the war, manipulation, and silent destruction in Stefan's visions, Father Elias expected only despair. Instead, the shepherd gave him one final clue: a place, not named directly but described with obsessive precision, as if Stefan knew the survival of future generations might depend on decoding it correctly. He said there would be one land only, one refuge beyond the main arc of destruction, one place separated enough from the centers of collapse that life could continue while the rest of the world convulsed. It was, according to him, far from the great fire zones of the age, remote, isolated by ocean, vast in scale, and marked by a strange symbol that he repeated more than once: 3 crosses. That final detail became the key. For years, interpreters in this fictional world struggled with the clue. Some imagined a frozen wilderness, others looked toward remote islands, but Stefan had also said this refuge would remain livable, fertile, and capable of supporting ordinary human life after the worst of the conflict had passed. That ruled out the barren extremes of the planet. What remained was a continent-like nation at the far edge of the inhabited world, protected by distance and water. In the logic of this script, the answer eventually points toward Australia. From the perspective of a rural European visionary in the 19th century, Australia would indeed have felt like the far end of the earth, vast, remote, ocean-bound, removed from the centers of Old World war. And the symbol of the 3 crosses finds its dramatic echo in the flag traditions and southern sky imagery associated with the nation. Whether one treats that as mystical accuracy or symbolic coincidence, it becomes the emotional climax of Stefan's warning. There is one refuge, but it is not reached through panic. It is reached through understanding. Yet the deeper meaning of the refuge is not merely geography. Stefan did not describe it as salvation for the arrogant or the violent. He described it as sanctuary for those who remained inwardly awake. The place mattered. But so did the condition of the people arriving there. A safe shore means little to those who have already surrendered their humanity. That is what makes the clue powerful. It operates on 2 levels. 1, a literal refuge at the edge of the world. 2, a moral refuge, a call to return to coherence, humility, and truth before crisis fully arrives. And still, one final mystery remained. How had Stefan seen any of this at all? In the final section of the legend around Stefan Draven, the explanation becomes stranger still. Years after his death, workers restoring the old family property are said to have discovered something buried beneath the floorboards of his sleeping room. A perfectly rounded stone sphere, unnaturally smooth, far too precise to look accidental, and unlike anything the villagers could have made with their tools. In the folklore surrounding Stefan, this object was not a relic of ordinary craft. It was treated as a source, a catalyst, the mysterious anchor of his visions. According to the story, Sinner Stefan once hinted that the sphere had fallen from the sky long before anyone thought to dig beneath the house. He believed it carried an unusual field, something neither purely material nor purely spiritual, something capable of amplifying perception far beyond the normal limits of the mind. To modern listeners, that sounds impossible. To believers, it sounds like confirmation that humanity does not understand the universe nearly as well as it pretends to. The legend deepens when similar stone spheres are found in other parts of the world, not as proof of one simple theory, but as reminders that human history is full of anomalies our certainties cannot easily absorb. That is where Stefan's story becomes less about one prophet and more about the problem of arrogance itself. We assume that because something lies outside accepted models, it must be meaningless, false, or primitive. But what if some truths are lost precisely because modern people no longer know how to recognize them? Stefan's supposed gift, in this fictional retelling, was never presented as personal greatness. It was presented as burden. He did not enjoy the future. He suffered it. He trembled under it. He cried because he saw what people would do to themselves in the name of progress, safety, and power. He understood that the real tragedy of humanity is not ignorance. It is pride. The stone sphere, whether literal or symbolic, represents a door the modern mind has slammed shut. A reminder that reality may be far wider than our institutions, industries, and algorithms are willing to admit. And that is why the script ends not with spectacle, but with a question. What if the world survives not through greater control, but through greater humility? So where does this leave us? Not with certainty, not with a timetable, not with permission to surrender to panic. It leaves us with a warning story, one that speaks less about destiny than about direction. If humanity continues trading human intimacy for digital hypnosis, wisdom for power, healing for domination, and humility for control, then the future may indeed become colder, quieter, and more deceptive than anything previous generations feared. But Stefan's final lesson is not hopelessness. It is choice. The real battlefield in this script is not only the Middle East, the frozen North, or hidden laboratories underground. It is the human spirit. It is the dinner table, the conscience, the small daily decision to remain present, compassionate, and morally awake in an age that rewards distraction, speed, and emotional numbness. A civilization cannot be saved by better machines if its people no longer know how to love, listen, or resist manipulation. That is why the most powerful counterforce to the silent weapon is not louder violence. It is awakened humanity, families who refuse to disappear into screens, communities that share truth faster than fear, scientists who choose healing over obedience, citizens who stop mistaking convenience for meaning, leaders who understand that power without restraint becomes a curse, and ordinary people who do not wait for catastrophe before remembering what is sacred. The refuge at the edge of the world may be literal in the story. But there is another refuge too, one inside the human soul. A place untouched by propaganda, untouched by greed, untouched by the seduction of technological domination. If that refuge dies, no nation can save us. If it survives, perhaps even dark futures can still be rewritten. So tonight, before the screen goes dark, ask yourself something simple. What in your life is real enough to survive a silent war? Who around you needs your attention more than your device? And if history is turning toward danger, what kind of human being do you intend to become before the turning is complete? Subscribe to the channel, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story.